In this section, you'll learn about the National Airspace System, or NAS. The purpose of the NAS is to establish a safe and efficient airspace environment for civil, commercial, and military aviation. Under FAA Part 107 regulations, drone pilots are required to obtain permission from air traffic control before operating in Class B airspace. Class B airspace is the most restrictive and controlled airspace, typically surrounding major airports and extending upward from the surface to an altitude of 10,000 feet or higher. Here are some key things to know about operating drones in Class B airspace. Obtain permission from ATC. Drone pilots must obtain permission from ATC before operating in Class B airspace. This can be done through FAA's Low Altitude Authorization and Notification Capability, or LANC system, by submitting a request directly to the airport or ATC facility. Plan ahead. Drone pilots should plan their flights carefully and check the airspace restrictions and requirements before conducting a flight in or near Class B airspace. It's important to have thorough understanding of airspace, including any restrictions or special procedures that may be in place. Following ATC instructions. Once permission is granted, drone pilots must follow the instructions provided by ATC. This may include altitude and flight path restrictions, as well as any other instructions specific to the airspace or airport. Maintain visual line of sight. Drone pilots must maintain VLOS with their drone at all times, even when operating in Class B airspace. It's important to be aware of the other aircraft in the airspace and be prepared to take evasive action if necessary. By following these guidelines, drone pilots can operate safely and effectively in Class B airspace in compliance with FAA Part 107 regulations. The FAA Part 107 regulations govern the operation of small unmanned aircraft systems, also known as drones, for commercial purposes. Part 107 establishes the requirements for obtaining a remote pilot certificate, which is required for individuals who operate drones for commercial purposes. Class C airspace is a type of controlled airspace that extends from the surface to a specified altitude above ground level, typically up to 4,000 feet above the airspace elevation. Class C airspace is usually located around medium-sized airports with a significant amount of air traffic. Class C airspace is a type of controlled airspace that extends from the surface to a specified altitude above ground level, typically up to 4,000 feet above the airport elevation. Class C airspace is usually located around medium-sized airports with a significant amount of air traffic. In order to operate a drone in Class C airspace, the remote pilot must obtain prior authorization from the FAA. This can be done through FAA's online Drone Zone portal or by contacting the air traffic control tower responsible for the airspace. The FAA may require additional training or certification for remote pilots who wish to operate in Class C airspace, depending on the specific requirements of the airspace and the nature of the operation. It is important for remote pilots to understand and comply with all applicable regulations and requirements when operating a drone in any airspace. Under FAA Part 107, Class D airspace is defined as airspace in which both instrument flight rules, IFR, and visual flight rules, VFR, flights are permitted, but the control tower has the authority to deny access to airspace as necessary for the safety of other aircraft or persons on the ground. To fly a drone in Class D airspace, the pilot must obtain prior authorization from the air traffic control tower before entering the airspace. This can be done through FAA's Low Altitude Authorization and Notification Capability, or LANC system, by contacting the tower directly. It's important to note that pilots must also follow any additional requirements and restrictions imposed by the ATC for the specific Class D airspace. Failure to comply with these requirements can result in serious consequences, including fines and/or revocation of the pilot's license. Under FAA Part 107, Class E airspace is defined as airspace in which both IFR and VFR flights are permitted, but there is no control tower or air traffic control services provided. Class E airspace extends from either the surface or a designated altitude up to the overlying controlled airspace. For drone pilots operating in Class E airspace, there's generally no requirement to obtain prior authorization from the ATC. However, there are some exceptions, such as when flying in Class E airspace that is designated as an active military operations area or restricted area. It's important to note that even though no ATC services are provided in Class E airspace, drone pilots are still required to comply with all relevant FAA regulations and restrictions, including those related to altitude, speed, and airspace boundaries. In addition, pilots must ensure that their drone remains within their line of sight at all times, and they must take steps to avoid other aircraft and hazards. Under FAA Part 107, Class G airspace is defined as the airspace that is uncontrolled and typically extends from the surface up to either the overlying Class E airspace or 1,200 feet above ground level, whichever is higher. In some cases, Class G airspace may extend higher. For drone pilots operating in Class G airspace, there's no requirement to obtain prior authorization from ATC. However, drone pilots are still required to comply with all relevant FAA regulations and restrictions, including those related to altitude, speed, and airspace boundaries. In addition, pilots must ensure that their drone remains within their line of sight at all times, and they must take steps to avoid other aircraft and hazards. It's important to note that while Class G airspace is uncontrolled, it does not mean that it's free from other aircraft. Pilots should always be aware of their surroundings and take steps to avoid any potential collisions. Additionally, pilots should be aware of any local rules or restrictions that may apply to drone operations in the area. Under FAA Part 107, Special Use Airspace, SUA, refers to airspace in which activities such as military operations, air shows, or rocket launches take place. SUA includes a variety of airspace types, such as restricted areas, prohibited areas, warning areas, and military operation areas. For drone pilots operating in SUA, specific rules and restrictions may apply, depending on the type of SUA and activities taking place. In some cases, drone operations may be prohibited entirely in certain types of SUA. To determine whether a particular area is designated as SUA and whether drone operations are permitted, pilots should consult relevant aeronautical charts and other available resources. Pilots may need to obtain prior authorization from the appropriate ATC or military authority before flying in SUA. It's important to note that failure to comply with SUA rules and restrictions can result in serious consequences, including fines and/or revocation of the pilot's license. Therefore, drone pilots should always exercise caution and follow all applicable regulations and guidelines when flying in or near SUA. Under FAA Part 107, military training routes, MTRs, are designated corridors of airspace used by military aircraft for training purposes. MTRs are classified as either IFR, Instrument Flight Rules, or VFR, Visual Flight Rules. They are typically located in remote or sparsely populated areas. Drone pilots operating in or near MTRs should exercise caution and be aware of potential hazards, such as low-flying military aircraft or other obstacles. It's important to note that drone pilots are generally not required to obtain authorization to fly in or near MTRs unless the MTR is located in SUA or if there are specific local rules or restrictions in place. However, drone pilots are still required to comply with all relevant FAA regulations and restrictions, including those related to altitude, speed, and airspace boundaries. In addition, pilots must ensure that their drone remains within their line of sight at all times, and they must take steps to avoid other aircraft and hazards. To ensure safe operations, the FAA recommends that drone pilots check relevant aeronautical charts and other resources to determine location and boundaries of MTRs in their area. Pilots should also be aware of any local rules or restrictions that may apply to drone operations in the area. Under FAA Part 107, temporary flight restrictions, TFRs, and notices to airmen, NOTAMs, are two types of airspace restrictions that drone pilots should be aware of. TFRs are put into place to protect the safety of people or property in the air or on the ground. TFRs can be issued for a variety of reasons, including sporting events, wildfire operations, and presidential visits. TFRs can vary in size and shape, and drone pilots are generally prohibited from flying within them without specific authorization. NOTAMs are a way for the FAA to communicate important information to pilots about changes to airspace conditions, such as the closure of a runway or the presence of an obstacle. Drone pilots should always check for relevant NOTAMs before flying, as they can provide important information about potential hazards or restrictions in the area. To find out if there are any TFRs or NOTAMs in effect in a particular area, drone pilots should consult relevant aeronautical charts, the FAA's UAS facility maps, or the FAA's Drone Zone website. Additionally, pilots can contact their local flight service station, FSS, or Automated Flight Service Station, AFSS, for the latest information. It's important to note that failure to comply with TFRs or other airspace restrictions can result in serious consequences, including fines and/or revocation of the pilot's license. Therefore, drone pilots should always exercise caution and follow all applicable regulations and guidelines when flying in or near areas with TFRs or other airspace restrictions. Congratulations on making it this far. We've said a lot about the basics of drone regulations and gotten into some of the more complicated concepts. Why don't you take a stab at the midterm quiz and see how you do? I'll see you in the next lesson.